It looks like just about everybody is there, so if it's okay, I think I'll start with the session. All right, so I'm going to give you the super short version of this session, and maybe we'll cut the next one down a little bit too, because I know a lot of people are interested in learning about data relationships. So the first point I want to make is that we're going to give you these slides at the end of this, and there's actually an ebook that covers this topic. And most of the things that I'm about to cover now are also covered in here. So if you follow this link, which takes you to the resources, you should see it. Okay, so what are data relationships? Data relationships are a very important concept in application design. So an example of a data relationship would be IMDb, which is the movie database. So when you think about IMDb, it can be kind of an addictive site to go through because you can start looking up one movie and then you can see all of the actors that were in it, and then you might click on that actor, and then you might see all the movies that they were in, and then you might go down this chain where you just keep seeing more and more information. That's because IMDb is a database that has a lot of relationships in it. So this example here shows Humphrey Bogart was an actor. You could see all the movies he's in, and vice versa. We could look at Casablanca and see all the actors that were in the movie. That's just relating two entities, like Taylor was talking about, relating movies and actors. Another example is this concept that Tejas just told me about, which is kind of crazy. There's this idea that there's 6 degrees of Wikipedia. So you can start on one Wikipedia page and end up on any other Wikipedia page in just 6 clicks of Wikipedia links. And there's actually a Wikipedia page about this, of course. And there's all these crazy examples, like people have shown how you can go from like Jesus to Hitler in a few clicks, and it's very weird. I don't know why people spend their time on it, but if you've ever spent hours on Wikipedia, I'm sure you know about this. So really, the point to stress here is data relationships allow you to see the connections between things. So why do you want to relate data in Zoho Creator? That's what we all came here for, right? The first reason is you want to be able to connect the data across your forms. So here's an example from Karen's cooking class. In our first session, what we actually did is when somebody's registering, maybe they choose a lesson with a drop-down. And a drop-down field isn't really the best way to do that, because if you add in more lessons in the future, or a lesson has finished and you want to take it off the list, you're always updating that drop-down. But actually, it makes a lot more sense to structure your application so you have records of all your lessons, and then you're looking them up when somebody goes to register. We're just looking up all of the lessons that we've already entered in a different part of our application. And so what relationships allow you to do is enter information only one time, and then it won't have to be re-entered in a bunch of other places, which can cause a lot of problems. So the other benefit you get from this is that you don't have to reuse lengthy field options. So what do I mean by that? So this is actually kind of a nifty little thing that you may not have realized you can do. I've actually embedded a creator form in the middle of a slideshow. It's kind of crazy, right? So if you had accounts that were allowing you to embed, you too could be up here embedding things on slideshows. And so the example I was just talking about, though, is reusing lengthy field options. So imagine you have an application where you want to track your projects and your workers, and you want to see which workers are assigned to which projects and vice versa. So if we have a bunch of workers in our company, we could enter all of their records into a form, and then we can just look up that form in different places. So rather than having to re-enter all these people's names every time we want to have a field where we're picking workers, we could just enter in the worker information one time, and then we can use a lookup field to display all of their names anywhere else in our application just by dragging a lookup field onto a form. So imagine you use this application to track their projects, but you might also have other forms where you're tracking the number of hours they worked or the number of days off they've taken. Instead of having to re-enter their names, you just use a lookup field and you reference your form, which has all of the workers stored in it. It's much faster. Okay, so The other thing is that you can see data from multiple forms on one report. Crazy concept, right? So what does that mean? Let me switch over to one of my examples here. So this is actually the application where I had embedded that form, where we have projects entered, and then we also have a form for workers. So this is all of our workers. So normally in Zoho Creator, if you don't have a lookup field, then you can't combine information from two different forms and put it together on one report. But once you use a lookup field, you can actually do that very easily. So if I add in a project using this project form, this is what it would look like before I have combined data, right? All I have is information about the projects, but I might want to take a look at which workers are assigned to each of these projects. So after I add in a lookup field, I could do that, and I could see something more like this. So now we have the name of the project as these like darker bars here, and then we can see a list of each worker that's been assigned to that project. So we're getting the project information and the worker information all mashed up in one place. And then if we wanted to see more information about a worker, we could just click on one of their names, and we could actually get just a detailed view of their information. So I just clicked on Donald Willis, and his information shows up right here. So that is actually one of the most powerful reasons to use lookup fields, is the ability to combine data together. Okay, and I think you kind of get this concept, but I'll briefly go through this. You can enter data once and apply updates everywhere. So now let's take a look back at this report where we see all of our projects and all the workers on them, right? So maybe I'm a manager and I want to go in here and I need to call Randy Sims for some reason, right? Well, Randy Sims' phone number on this report is actually not being entered in the projects form, it's being entered in the workers form. So let's say we have Randy Sims on this project, and he's on this project, and he's on that project. So if I update his phone number with a lookup field, his phone number is going to change in every single place that it appears here automatically. If I make one update, it appears everywhere. Now I can show you that real quick. If I go into workers, I'll choose, let's choose, do we have the same example? Oh yeah, here's Randy. I'll make his phone number something crazy so we can see it. And I go back to the project report, workers by project, and you can see we have Randy Sims. His number has been updated in every slot, right? So it's very useful to build your applications this way because it saves you a lot of headaches and pain. So there's a few different kinds of data relationships that exist, and the first one is called a one-to-one relationship, and this is a very common one. So when you think about it, if there's one thing on each side of the equation, then you have a one-to-one relationship. So what do I mean? Each employee at a company only has one job, right? They're only ever going to have one job at a time. Each product can only ever, at Zoho that's not true though. We actually break that rule. And each product could only ever have one manufacturer. It could never have been made by more than one manufacturer, right? Each person only has one social security number unless they're committing fraud. And then we have one-to-many relationships. To figure out what kind of relationship goes into your app, you just kind of have to think about it in this way. Is it a one-to-one? Is it a one-to-many? So here's some examples. Each department in a company probably has multiple employees. Each order in an Amazon order could have multiple items. It could also have one item. But if there's ever the possibility that it'll have more than one item, you want to create that relationship as a one-to-many. That's going to be important when you're actually building your creator applications. And finally, another example, maybe related to Karen's cooking class, one class could have multiple students in it, right? And then finally, there are many-to-many relationships. These relationships tend not to occur as frequently, but they do exist. So imagine an academic textbook. It usually has multiple authors. Each one of those authors has probably written for multiple textbooks. Another example could be doctors and patients. Each doctor is going to have a lot of patients they attend to, And each patient may have multiple doctors, because they could have a skincare specialist and a cardiologist, whatever. And then finally, like the example I showed earlier, there could be projects and workers. Each project has several workers. Each worker could also be doing several projects. So to create data relationships in Zoho Creator, we use what's called lookup fields. So when you drag a lookup field onto a form, this is the first thing you see. And basically, you're just choosing which information you want to be looking up. And so the way you do that is you first choose which application is that information in. And then you choose which form is that information in. And then you choose which field am I actually going to show people when they're choosing this relationship. So in our example of the workers and the projects, we would probably be choosing like the worker name when we're using a lookup field on the projects form. And then the other thing that you have to choose is the display type. And so this is kind of a subtle part of the whole process. It's just this little drop down right over here, but it's actually very important, because the display type that you choose is going to determine what kind of relationship gets created in your application. So this is an essential part of building data relationships for your app. So if you want to build a one-to-one relationship, you would use a drop-down or a radio lookup. So I'm just actually going to switch over here so you can see what this process looks like. Maybe, might help. And I will go into this example, and I'll drag on. If you just look at the fields over here down at the bottom, we have lookup fields. So that's what we're talking about here. And I will just drag that on anywhere. So this is the box we would see. Maybe we want to relate our workers to the projects. I would choose workers, and then I'd choose their name. And then when I go down to display type, we have these 4 options here. I'm trying to zoom in, but maybe I've reached a limit here. I don't know. Wait, there we go. Now we're zoomed in a bit more. Okay, so when I click that, there's a few options that show up. This is what I'm talking about when I'm showing you the next couple of slides. So if you've thought about your application, the one that you're actually building, and you've realized that something should be a one-to-one relationship, then you need a drop-down or a radio lookup. And these are just to remind you what a drop-down radio look like. Those are the fields where you just get one option. You can't pick more than one option on those fields, so that's why you choose those. If you need a one-to-many relationship, then when you're dragging on your lookup, you either want to do a checkbox or a multi-select, because both of those let you pick more than one option. And I can tell you right now, it's almost always going to be a drop-down in the case of one-to-one, or a multi-select in the case of subform, just because those fields are easier to use, they're faster, they're prettier, everyone likes them. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is display fields. So I'm going to go over to Karen's cooking class. And right now, our instructors field is just this multiple choice, right? This is just a drop-down, and we're actually going to get rid of this because we realize now that this is not actually relating to our instructor's form, and we want to create a relationship. We want to build our application the smart way, right? So I'm going to drag on a lookup field. So if you're in Karen's cooking class, you want to go onto the lessons form, get rid of whatever instructor's field you see there, and drag on a lookup. So now what I want to do is choose the instructor's form. That's what we're going to relate to. And then maybe we want to have the instructor's first name as our field, right? And in this example, we could say, hey, maybe there's multiple instructors for each cooking class, right? So in that case, we would want to do a multi-select or a checkbox. We're actually going to keep things simple. We're just going to say each lesson that Karen teaches, there's only one instructor for that lesson. So we're just going to go with a drop-down, the first name, and I'll hit done. So now, let's say we don't just display the first name in this form, right? Because maybe we have two instructors that are named John. How are we going to tell them apart? So if you scroll over to the right here, we have what's called display fields. Oops, I started scrolling down. So when you've selected your lookup field, make sure it's selected, you'll see this in the properties over on the right side. And if you click the plus button, we can actually display other information in here. So for example, if we want first name and last name, I can choose the last name field and add that in here. And then what these little boxes do is they let you add in other characters. So we can see a preview down here of what this will actually look like. So I could delete all these spaces and just have no space between them. I don't know why I would do that, but maybe there's cases where you want to put parentheses around one of your fields, something like that. You can use these boxes here. Okay. Everyone all caught up? Cool. So there's a little tip that I could give you guys. Maybe in our registration form, we want to display the title of the lesson, because the registration form is where people go when they're signing up for a cooking lesson, right? So we want to show them the title of the lesson. We also want to let them know how long that lesson is going to be, and we have that in a duration field. So what we could do with our field properties is we could put in the duration, and then we could have an empty field which allows us to put information after the last field we're displaying. So what am I talking about? I think I have this right here. Okay, so maybe we want to display our lesson name like this, right? We have the title, we have the parentheses, and then this is our field. This number is going to be our duration. And then we want to add on minutes. We want to tell people this duration is in minutes, right? So one way you can do that is by adding on a field to one of your forms which has no values entered in it. And so that allows us to use this little box here. So when we're using the display fields, we could put a little box right here, which will go after the duration. But because this field never has a value, nothing will ever be displayed after where we say minutes, close parentheses. So I know that's maybe a little hard to visualize, but you guys get the idea? So if I had had more time, I probably would have showed you a little bit more in depth how that works. But if you want to try that out, you can do it. And so what you would do is you would go into your lessons form, you just drag on some kind of field, maybe a single line, and just name it something to remind yourself this field will never have anything in it. We'll just call it empty, right? So you could drag that on here, and I'll just do this real quick. Empty. Okay. And then later on, when we learn more about workflows in the next session, we can learn how to just hide that field. So that way we always have option open to us, but it's not going to bug us and show up in our form, right? We can actually hide fields when people are filling out a form. In the case where you are somebody who needs a many-to-many relationship in your application, what you would do is you would choose a multi-select bidirectional lookup field. And I know that that is the worst name for anything, but we'll cover bidirectional in just a second. We'll explain what that means. So the other thing I want to talk about is filters. And so this is another step where I'm going to start doing stuff on stage. And if you want to get through this session a little bit faster, you might want to follow along with me. So I'm going to go into Karen's cooking app. I'm going to click on lessons up here. I'm going to switch to the registrations form. And right now we have a similar situation where we've been using a drop-down field, but we actually want to create a data relationship instead. So I'm just going to delete our current lesson field. And then I'm going to drag on a lookup. Put that after the zip code. So when somebody's signing up, this is where they're going to pick which lesson they're signing up for. And then I'll choose our lessons form. And somewhere on the lessons form fields, we should have one called title. So we want to display the title of our lesson. And remember that each person can only sign up for one lesson at a time. We could have done it one-to-many, but we thought that would complicate things, and we wanted to kind of get through this quickly. So each time you sign up, you're signing up for one cooking class. Okay, so once we have that in here, now we can take a look at filters, which show up right here. Okay, so once you have your lookup field, select it and look at the properties on the right. You should see properties called choices. So if we choose set filter, we can actually control which information from our other form is going to be displayed to people in that lookup field, right? And so the first thing you pick is a field. So in our lessons form, we have something to track the capacity of a lesson. So maybe we create a new lesson, planning it for a week from now, and we know that we have 10 slots available there, right? And once that lesson fills up, our capacity is going to keep going down until it reaches 0. And at that point, we don't want to let anyone else sign up for this, otherwise we'll have too many students. So we're going to pick the capacity field. And then I'm going to choose an operator, so greater than 0. So what this filter is doing is we could have some lessons saved in our lessons form, and we're recording their capacity, and then once that lesson fills up, it's going to hide it from our lookup field automatically. So we don't even have to really think about that. We're always only displaying lessons that still have slots available. And so there's a lot of different ways you could do this. You can also add multiple filters. So if I mouse over right here, I can click this add condition subgroup thing, and I could actually add in a whole bunch of different criteria for my filter here. So maybe I could also only show lessons that have a certain start time. So for example, I only want to show lessons where the start time is after a particular day. I could add that in as a filter. And then the other thing I want to point out is we have and or here. So you could set it to and if you want all of your criteria to matter, where it's going to filter and show only lessons that match everything you've put up there. Or you can use or where it has to match one or the other, right? So either the capacity is a certain number or the start time is at a certain time, right? But I'm actually just going to get rid of that second option. I just kind of wanted to show you how that works, and I will hit done. So if I was being a more careful app builder, what I would actually do is add in a variable into that filter where I could say, only show lessons that have a start time after the current time, right? Because otherwise we have to always go in there and think, okay, well, there's a lesson that's happening today, and somebody might see it on the website, and they might sign up for it, right? But we don't want them to sign up because they're too late. So we could actually add in a filter for something like that. Okay, so there's a couple tips with filters I just want to go through real quick. So when you filter something that is using a text field, it needs to be put in quotation marks. So if I go back to this filtering interface, capacity is a number field, right? But imagine I had chosen something else, like description. That would be a text field, right? I could say what that description needs to be, right? So maybe I only want to show fields where the description says, really cool lesson, right? We have to put quotation marks around that. And I think if you use a single line field, it'll actually do this automatically for you. You'll see some quotation marks just show up when you choose that field, and you just want to make sure you don't delete those when you start typing in your criteria there. Okay. Oh yeah, so here's an example. Maybe we want to show only lessons where the name of the instructor is not Karen, right? If for whatever reason we wanted to do that, that's how you do it. You put Karen's name in quotes. This is just a short tip. If you're using like a text field, there's two options that seem pretty similar. One of them is equals and one of them is contains. So if we did equals, it would be case sensitive, and that could cause some problems if maybe we mess up the casing of a name or a word. So contains is generally better. There's also, if you're using text fields in your filter, there's something called ends with. So you could actually like filter by emails that end with .org or something like that if you're working in the nonprofit sector, right? This is a little bit confusing, but when you choose a date field in your filter, I will show you what happens. So I'll choose set filter, and maybe we'll choose the start time of a lesson. We get all of these options. Oh, I need to zoom in before I do this. Okay. So we get all of these options that are configured for a date. So maybe the date equals a particular time, maybe it's before or after a particular time. And then we also have these more relative things, like the date is yesterday or today or last week, and it goes all the way down the list to months and even years. So what's a little bit misleading about this is if you do last n days and you put in a number, so maybe we want to say only, maybe, what's a better example? Do we have next n days? Yeah, there we go. So we only want to display lessons that are happening in the next 3 days for some reason, right? So next n days, and then we put in 3, we would assume that any lesson happening today or in the next 3 days would show up. But it's actually not the case where when you choose last n days or next n days, it's not counting today. It's counting the previous 2 days or the next 2 days and not today. So what could we do about that? Is there any way we could fix that? And normally, I would make this a quiz, but I'm just going to tell you guys the answer since we're short on time. So we could actually add in multiple criteria, right? So this is an example where maybe we want to look at employees based on the date that they were hired, right? So we could do the last 2 days or date hired is today, right? And that's like how a human would think about this problem, right? We would say, when we say last 2 days, we're counting today. Okay. So this is from Taylor's session. The arrows are all the relationships that we're supposed to create, and these are the relationships that I want you guys to build in your application. So we've already added in a couple of these. So for example, we have connected the lessons and registrations, right? So if you look at this diagram, we can see we had already planned this out. We want our lessons to show up in the registrations form. I think we also did instructors, maybe? Yeah, maybe we already covered that. So what I want you guys to do now for the next couple of minutes is take a look at this slide and see if you can figure out the data relationships for all these other arrows and add those into your application. So I know Sajal didn't really make it through this, but you should have a feedback form in your application now. So you'll want to make sure you know how to navigate to that. And let's see if you can add in all of these data relationships on your own. With the feedback form, I want to add in a lookup to lessons. So we can see which lesson that our students are giving feedback about. That was the idea of this form. So we can send this form out almost as like a survey to people when they finish a lesson, right? So I'm going to choose the lessons form, and I'm going to choose the title of the lesson. And then I am going to add in another lookup. So we also want to see which instructor are they reviewing each time, right? So we'll choose the first name there. And we can even add in a property to show their last name also. And then finally, I think there's one more for feedback. Yeah, so we also want to connect the registration form with the feedback form. And the reason we're doing that is because the registrations form really contains all of our student data. When you look at these attributes, we see first name, last name. Maybe we want to track which students are giving feedback each time, right? So we could add in a lookup for registration, and we'll choose the first name. And again, I can go into the display fields, and we can add in another option for last name here. So I'll add that in. Okay, so when we actually, later on, when we send out this feedback form, Akil is going to show you how we could actually automatically fill in some of these lookups. So we could send an email out to a student asking for their feedback, and we can have this preloaded with their name. And I'm actually going to change the name of this field since it's really not registrations, it's actually students that we're talking about here. I'm going to rename that. Okay. So we've added in all the relationships to the feedback form, and I believe we've added in instructors to lessons. I'll double check that. So if we look on our lessons form, we have this instructors lookup right here. Okay, so that's all of the relationships there. Before we jump into subforms is actually how do we combine information from two different forms onto one report? So once you've created all these lookups, you might want to see information about your feedback information on a lesson combined with information about the student that gave that feedback, for example. So I'm going to show you how this works. And this is actually the data that we are going to relate in a report. So if I go into Karen's cooking class and I go into the live mode here, we could see our registrations reports, and we see all of our student data inside the registrations report. So now, if I click on the little wrench icon at the bottom, I'm going to click Edit this application. And then what I would do is I would go to column properties. So over on the left, there's a whole bunch of options here for editing this report, but column properties is what we're looking at. And you can see in the column properties, this is all of the columns of our report. And we can actually drag and drop these to change the order, right? But to add in the related information about the lesson that somebody has signed up for, maybe we want to see the instructor that goes with that lesson, right? We could go down to the bottom. Here, I'll actually undo this. If you look at the bottom right corner, you'll see this option called Select Related Form. And if you choose that, any form that you've added a lookup field to is going to show up here. So I can choose lessons. And then all of the fields from my lessons form show up. So maybe I want to see what instructor is doing a particular lesson. I could drag that on here. Oh, I think it's because I'm zoomed in. I'm having issues rearranging it. Move that down. Nope. Okay. Working in a zoomed in environment is never very fun. But pretty cool, right? You can add in any field about an option chosen in a lookup can be added to this report. So I got a few other things I want to show you here. Earlier I talked about when you create many-to-many relationships, how you have to have a bidirectional lookup field. And that's actually just a fancy word for creating a lookup field on two different forms, right? So in our example with the, this is a different example. On our example with the workers and the projects, we have this lookup field on our projects, which is referring to the workers, and we also have the lookup field on workers, which is referring to the projects that they're working on, right? So there are two ways that you could create that setup. One is you could just manually go to each form, and you could drag on whatever lookup field you want to drag on. And the other thing you could do is we could drag on a lookup field, and I'm just going to recreate this one for looking up projects since this example is already fully built. But maybe we want to look up the project name here, right? And then what we could do is, okay, so when I select our lookup field, which we've already added, if you look over on the right,
Okay.
we have this section called bidirectional relation. So if you check that box, you'll get a little pop-up here. And what's really crazy about this is we have this little thing called fields to be related. And what that should really be called is display field, because what you're choosing there is which field from this form do we want to show on our other form, which we're adding a lookup to, right? So probably you would choose like the worker name in this case. So now the last thing I want to go through real quick is subforms. So subforms are another way to create a one-to-many relationship, and I'm going to explain some of the differences between subforms and lookups now. So you only need to use a subform when you're filling out multiple fields while you create a relationship. So in our example with Karen's cooking class, pretty much everything is a one-to-one relationship, right? You're registering and you're creating a relationship to one lesson. What happens if, when you create that relationship, you also need to enter some kind of detail about that lesson? So here's an example of when you might want a subform. So in this case, we have orders and items, right? So each order that you make at an online business, you could have multiple items in it, right? So maybe we'll choose a customer and we have a date for our order. So these fields up here are our main fields. That's part of our regular form. And then this little thing with the lines and the add new, that's actually our subform. So we're relating the information, like our customer name and the date of the order, to all of the items in the order, right? And so each time we add an item to this order, we might need to put in some extra information about it. So maybe Taylor is ordering one widget and he's ordering 5 gizmos, right? So when he's creating his relationship, he's also specifying something about this relationship. How many of these items is he getting, right? And there's other examples of when you could use subforms, but this is one of the most common ones that we have. Another example of using a subform with all these rows is that you could build kind of a price calculator inside Zoho Creator. So maybe you want some kind of tool that calculates a price based off of all these different criteria for you, and you want it to happen really fast. So you could create a subform and add in some scripts to it, and when somebody adds up all of these rows, you could have a field like this, like the order total, which is actually being filled in by some script. So that's what a subform is. And the important thing to know about subforms, though, is that they're a little bit limited when it comes to reporting options. So if I go into our orders report here, we're only seeing a little bit of information, right? So we're only seeing the fields that were on our main form and what happened to our subform. So actually, when you add in a subform, by default, you're not seeing all of the information on that subform, but you can actually reveal it if you go into the report settings. So by default, when you create a subform, when you go and view the report later on, you'll probably only see the first field in that subform. So like before we had the items and the number of the items, you'd only see which item was chosen, and we wouldn't see the number. So to fix that problem, you would go into your report in the live mode, and then click on the wrench and hit edit this application. So this is what we did earlier to go to report settings, right? And then we would go into column properties, and this lets us choose which columns will be displayed on our report. So we could actually drag on our item subform here. And then we can also choose which fields from our item subform are we going to display in this particular report. So right now we're showing the item, but I could also add in something else. So maybe I want to see the quantity of items. We could add that too. And to see all of this, you just have to click on the little link icon when you add on your subform field. Okay, and then you would hit create, and it's saved. So now if I go back to the report, we can zoom in here, and we can see that each record we've shown how many, what item was ordered in that order and how many of each item is in the order. And we could have used those little boxes to format this a little bit nicer, but you get the basic idea here. So the other thing where subforms are a little bit limited is that when you search based on a subform, you can only see, so I'll search for widgets. Oh, everything had a widget in it. Maybe I need to search for doohickeys. Okay. You can only search by the first field in your subform, right? So searching for doohickeys works, but what if I want to search by the number of items? Let's say we want to search by the items which had 2. None show up, right? So if we want to search through a report with all of those subform fields, we're actually limited to just whatever that first field is. That's kind of the drawback of using subforms for relationships. That's why I would recommend, if you have a one-to-many, in most cases, you want to use a multi-select lookup. But if you want to know the secret to actually making those subforms work the way they should be working, you can just add a lookup to each row of your subform, right? Because then what we could do is we could use the lookup field to relate each item ordered to the orders on the main form, and we could have better reporting options. So the reporting options that you get from a lookup field, where you can combine any information together and make it searchable, would show up on the subform. Okay, I think everyone's pretty much there, so probably, and we're set up for the rest of the day.